It started with a laugh, not the kind that lightens a room, but the kind that slices it. A laugh that made a marble chamber feel like a high school hallway, cold and performative. "Well, I reckon we've got ourselves a paper lawyer here," said Senator John Kennedy, leaning back in his chair, the southern lilt in his voice wrapped tight around condescension. He looked directly at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett as he said it. Third time now, same phrase, same smirk. Around him, a few aides snickered. Cameras didn't blink. Neither did Jasmine. The hearing on climate equity legislation had been tense already, but now it tipped. Jasmine sat motionless, not slouched, not rigid, just still. That stillness she carried in moments like this, it wasn't hesitation, it was calibration. What happened in the next 30 minutes didn't just resolve a tense public moment. It exposed something deeper about power, dignity, and truth in America. If this kind of story keeps you listening, like the video, comment your state and local time, subscribe for more voices that won't be silenced. Across the room, staffers shifted in their seats. Behind the dais, the chairman coughed softly, trying to move past the moment. But the air had changed. Jasmine didn't return the senator's gaze. She stared instead at the legislative binder in front of her, thumbing one page, then another. Her silence was not retreat, it was rope. Kennedy continued, pivoting now to a familiar talking point. That climate equity efforts were performative. That real environmental impact came from letting businesses lead. His voice, always tinged with theater, leaned heavier into folksy rhythm. "You can throw all the flowery legal talk you want," he said, "but if you've never been knee-deep in Cajun floodwater, you can't speak for the folks who are." Jasmine's eyes finally lifted. They weren't angry, they were observant. It was her first real movement in 12 minutes. The committee heard from a chemical engineer, then a Louisiana pastor who had witnessed 4 floods in 6 years. But each time Crockett tried to question a witness, Kennedy interrupted, sometimes with jokes, sometimes with clarifications on legal terminology. 3 times he used the phrase paper lawyer, each time louder, each time with a grin. The third time, he leaned in closer to his mic, like an old raconteur in a saloon tale. "And I just wonder if our colleague from Texas ever tried building a levee with a diploma." Silence. Then, chair recognizes Congresswoman Crockett. She stood slowly, not jerking or sighing, just unfolding upward like a tide-lifting stone. The microphone barely picked up her voice at first. "Senator Kennedy," she began, "you represent Louisiana's 5th District, correct?" He smiled wide. "The great people of it, yes, ma'am. Where Monroe, Alexandria, and St. Landry Parish sit." "That's right." "Where over 2,300 homes were lost in the 2016 floods alone, and 100 more in 2019? Kennedy blinked. "And where, as of the last FEMA report," she continued, holding up a thick folder, "some residents still haven't received full compensation?" A pause. No laughter now. "I've walked those neighborhoods, sir," she said, voice firm. "Not during campaign season, during mold season, the one that comes after the floods." She took a breath, then turned slightly, scanning the room. "I want them in her room, not just Kennedy. You call me a paper lawyer, but I've stood ankle deep in the same water your constituents called you about and never heard back. I know their names, I know which ones had to sleep in their cars. I know which ones are still waiting on reconstruction grants while their kids sleep in trailers behind gas stations." Kennedy leaned back, his smile dimming. Jasmine's voice stayed calm, steady. "I may have studied law on paper," she said, "but I practice justice where it lives, in basements that smell like mildew and loss." You could hear nothing in the room now but the low hum of the overhead lights, and then she delivered it, a line spoken without flourish. "Just wait. Senator, you cannot represent people you've never listened to underwater." The room stilled. The stenographer paused, as if the sentence itself demanded a new line. Kennedy opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. From the back, a young aide whispered, "She just won the day." No one laughed, no one clapped. But Jasmine didn't need sound. She returned to her seat, picked up her pen, and began writing. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a shift. Because in that room built for performance, She'd offered something rare, proportioned truth, held until the moment of highest precision. A counter-argument not built for clapbacks, but for consequence. Outside, the press pool hadn't even caught it yet, but inside, the temperature had changed. And John Kennedy, he stayed quiet the rest of the hearing. The marble in room 216 of the Hart Senate Office building had seen its share of spectacle, but rarely did it witness stillness used as a weapon. Jasmine Crockett's silence after the first insult wasn't strategic, it was spiritual. It came from years of courtrooms where volume didn't win cases, and from church pews where she'd learned patience could part waters thicker than politics. She didn't flinch when Kennedy first jabbed, nor when he leaned in again with the smug cadence of someone who assumed decorum was immunity. Jasmine had heard versions of that tone all her life. But what made this different, what made her take her time, was the setting. Because this wasn't just an insult, it was a test. And tests, she knew, were passed not by reaction, but by record. As Kennedy doubled down on paper lawyer, Jasmine had leaned back in her chair. Her fingers stayed gently folded in her lap, a posture that suggested she was praying or calculating. She made no effort to interrupt. Let him talk. Let the transcripts capture it all. Behind her, a junior legislative assistant scribbled notes with nervous urgency. To Jasmine's right, a colleague from Oregon gave her a sympathetic glance. But Jasmine didn't meet it. She was measuring something else. Timing. The first time Kennedy mocked her credentials, she'd smiled faintly. The second, she wrote down a timestamp. The third, she spoke. But before that moment, before her rise, there was only study. And that was something few in that room seemed to notice. Because while Kennedy performed for C-SPAN and donor clips, Jasmine was analyzing witness lists, staff memos, and district reports. She wasn't waiting. She was mapping. Every time Kennedy spoke, she tracked how far he wandered from legislative relevance. Every time he mentioned common sense, she noted which district maps he misquoted. She was watching a man unravel his own credibility. But still, she said nothing. That restraint didn't come easy. Just 2 years ago, during her first Oversight Committee hearing, Jasmine had been interrupted mid-sentence by a colleague who mistook her for a staffer. No apology, just a brush off and a chuckle. Moments like that taught her the value of silence that speaks later. Now here she was surrounded by mahogany desks and forced cordiality. But beneath the surface, tectonic tensions moved, not just between parties, but between generations, between styles, between realities. Kennedy's jabs weren't random. They were part of a larger architecture, a way Washington often worked. Disarm opponents by making them prove their right to speak. Undermine not with facts, but with tone. But Jasmine had grown up hearing that tone under different roofs. Barbershop debates, church sermons, family cookouts where uncles pushed buttons just to test who was watching. She learned early, when the room tilts against you, hold your center. And don't swing until you're holding more than a point. Hold the story. As Kennedy rambled about the real people, Jasmine opened a folder labeled Flood Response, LA05. It was thick with field reports, FEMA claims, and handwritten letters from residents she'd met while volunteering with climate organizers during a congressional recess. No staff, no press, just her, and soggy floorboards. She recalled one letter from a woman named Miss Loretta in St. Landry Parish. The water came up past my knees. I prayed you folks remembered we vote too. Jasmine never forgot that line. When Kennedy mocked her again, Miss Loretta's voice echoed louder than his. That's why Jasmine didn't just interrupt. She waited. Because if she'd spoken too soon, they would have called it emotional. If she'd snapped, they'd call it angry. But when she stood after the third insult, her case was airtight, and her hands were clean. This section of the hearing, before the clapback, was Jasmine's quiet power at its sharpest. Because what Kennedy didn't realize was that his showmanship was building her stage. And Jasmine, she wasn't the type to perform, she was the type to prosecute. The phrase that set it all in motion, paper lawyer, came a third time with a smirk so deliberate it might as well have been a match tossed into dry timber. And Jasmine Crockett stood. The motion was so seamless, it startled the room more than a raised voice would have. She didn't straighten her jacket or clear her throat. She just rose and let the quiet fall in behind her. The microphone picked up the soft slide of her chair against the floor. That was all. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to respond to the senator's remarks. Even Kennedy, who moments earlier had seemed buoyed by his own wit, faltered. Her voice was even, collected, no barbed tone, no raised pitch, just centered. What followed wasn't a rant. It was a sequence. Like a prosecutor laying out exhibits, she spoke with clarity that had the room recalibrating its attention. Senator Kennedy has now referred to me 3 separate times as a paper lawyer. I assume he's implying I'm unfamiliar with the practical application of law outside of academia. No reply. I want to make something clear for the record, she continued, lifting the folder she'd been reviewing. This file documents first-hand accounts from constituents of Louisiana's 5th District, your district, Senator, detailing their experiences during and after the floods of 2016, 2018, and 2019. She held up a black and white photo, a modest house submerged to its window panes. This is Miss Dorothy Samuel's home, flooded in March 2016. She called her representative's office, your office, 6 times. No call returned. Kennedy shifted, clearly unprepared for real names. This one, Jasmine flipped to another document, is a statement from a former school custodian named Glenn. He spent his FEMA stipend on water pumps and slept in his truck for 4 months. He never saw his senator either. The atmosphere changed again, this time not from insult, but evidence. I've walked through those streets, not because I represent them, but because I believe justice doesn't require borders. She turned then, not just to Kennedy, but to the entire panel. And I do not take offense to being called a paper lawyer, Senator. I take offense to the idea that paperwork, the kind that documents neglect, that traces environmental racism, that holds governments accountable, is somehow meaningless. She stepped slightly forward. Paper saved Glenn's claim from being discarded. Paper gave Ms. Samuels a temporary grant to rebuild. And paper, well-documented, thorough, undeniable paper, is the only reason we're sitting here pretending some of us still don't know the scale of this issue. A pause, then calmly, so I will wear that insult, and then I will use it to do my job. No dramatics, just a record, being set straight. Then she added what no one expected. Not an insult, not a clap back, but a legal trap. Senator, would you be willing to enter these constituent records into the congressional record under your name, since they originate from your district? Checkmate. Kennedy blinked. I'd have to review them. Jasmine nodded, unfazed. Of course, I have 23 more pages if you'd like to review before the next session. She returned to her seat, and for several seconds, no one spoke. It was a rebuke without rage, a rebuttal without raised volume, but its weight was unmistakable. The moment played out like a well-placed gavel strike, final, undeniable. And though the meeting continued, something had already shifted. The hearing would adjourn soon after. But within the hour, a Capitol intern with fast thumbs clipped the exact 45 seconds when Jasmine said, "You cannot represent people you've never listened to underwater." That was the quote. It took exactly 9 minutes for the video to reach Twitter, 16 minutes for #Crockett silences Kennedy to start trending. And by the time the committee's official transcript was uploaded, more people had watched Jasmine's quiet dismantling than had watched the entire previous month of hearings combined. Behind closed doors, Kennedy's staff debated how to contextualize his comments, but the damage was done. And Jasmine? She didn't need to explain what had happened. She'd made her point in the oldest courtroom tradition, by simply letting the record speak. The committee room had returned to order, technically. The chairman resumed the agenda with the dry monotony of protocol. Witnesses were thanked. Closing statements were requested. But beneath it all, a different energy simmered. Not from the heat of anger, but the static charge of something real, raw, having just happened. Jasmine Crockett didn't speak again. She didn't need to. Her statement had reshaped the air. Even those who didn't agree with her politics sat quieter, the kind of silence that doesn't come from being stunned, but from having nothing left to say. On C-SPAN, the camera cut to Kennedy twice. Both times he was looking down, fidgeting, writing notes that never made it into the record. His folksy demeanor had been replaced with a stiffness that no down-home metaphor could soften. But it was outside that the real storm began. Someone, a staffer from the press gallery, had uploaded the 45-second clip to TikTok with the caption, "Kennedy calls her paper lawyer." Her reply shuts down the room. Then Twitter, then Facebook, then WhatsApp groups in Baton Rouge and Monroe, where names like Ms. Dorothy Samuels weren't statistics, but neighbors. The moment hit a nerve, because it wasn't just the fact that a powerful man had been corrected. It was how it happened. No yelling, no dramatic exit, just one woman standing still and speaking facts with the calm of someone who knew the floodwaters by name. CNN aired the clip with a lower third banner that read, "Jasmine Crockett responds with receipts in heated climate hearing." MSNBC called it one of the most precise fact checks delivered live on record. Even Fox News covered it, though with less warmth, labeling it a viral clapback moment and questioning whether it was scripted. But the views kept climbing, 4 million by midnight. At Howard University, a student government panel played the clip to open their weekly meeting. At a barbershop in Shreveport, someone shouted, "She cooked," loud enough to rattle the wall mirror. And by the time the House returned the next morning, even senior staffers were whispering, "Did you hear what she said to Kennedy?" What struck most viewers wasn't the attack. It was the dignity. Jasmine's ability to wait, to choose precision over performance, to let the weight of injustice carry more authority than anger ever could. And in doing so, she held up a mirror, not just to Kennedy, but to the architecture of how politics often operates. Because in that 45 seconds, we saw it. A system where data loses to demeanor, where race and gender still tilt the scales, and where silence, strategic, righteous silence, can do more than any filibuster. That moment wasn't just a trend. It was a circuit breaker. If that moment hit you too, don't just sit with it. Comment below, share this story, subscribe, not for us, but for the truth still being erased. In Louisiana, that moment reawakened some very old questions. At Kennedy's next town hall, a high school student stood and asked, "Sir, why didn't you return Ms. Samuels' call in 2016? He paused, fumbled for a different anecdote, but the room remembered. And Jasmine? She spent the evening after the hearing in her office, not watching the coverage, but writing thank you notes to the flood survivors who'd let her tell their stories. Because for her, it wasn't the virality that mattered. It was the dignity of being heard, and knowing, finally, that someone had listened back. The sun rose over Capitol Hill the next day as if nothing had happened. But by 9:07 a.m., the first signs of backlash began to appear. A clipped, misleading version of the viral video was circulating on a fringe media platform. This version sliced Jasmine's full response into fragments, cutting her facts about Louisiana's flooding and instead looping her final line, "You cannot represent people you've never listened to underwater," with dramatic background music and flashing text. Democrat destroys Southern values. It didn't matter that it wasn't true. By 10 a.m., Kennedy's office had quietly emailed talking points to select press contacts, framing Jasmine's remarks as a rehearsed stunt intended to embarrass rather than legislate. An attached memo even claimed she insulted the people of Louisiana, though no such words had left her mouth. At 10:13 a.m., a known political troll account posted a deepfake, crudely done but convincing enough at first glance. In the altered video, Jasmine appeared to smirk after her closing line, followed by fake crowd applause. It was false, no one had clapped. She had not smirked, but the damage was already in play. Suddenly, the moment that had felt so pure, so anchored in truth, was being twisted into a caricature. Cable panels picked it up. One segment on a conservative morning show titled the story, "Crockett Grandstands While Louisiana Drowns." It wasn't a rebuttal, it was a rewriting. Inside the Capitol, Jasmine noticed the shift. Colleagues who had praised her privately were now silent in the hallway. A few aides looked away when she entered rooms. One representative even suggested, in a helpful tone, that she might avoid future hearings where tensions could escalate. It wasn't the overt smear that stung. It was the subtle retreat. Jasmine sat in her office, lights dimmed, rewatching the original C-SPAN clip. Not the viral one, not the doctored one. The raw footage. She listened not to herself, but to Kennedy, to the way he said paper lawyer with a drawl like it was both punchline and accusation, to how comfortable he was assuming that she, a black woman, needed to be put back in her place. She heard the architecture again, not of words but of assumption, and she realized something deeper. Her moment hadn't just gone viral, it had punctured something fragile in the culture of control. They weren't reacting to her because she yelled, she hadn't. They were reacting because she was undeniable. Later that night, as digital attacks mounted, something unexpected arrived. A handwritten letter, no return address, no postage mark, just delivered by hand to the security desk at the Rayburn building. Inside, I'm Glenn, from Opelousas. You told my story. You didn't even know me, but you got it right. We ain't paper, we're people. Thank you. She read it 3 times. That was the moment she stopped flinching. The deep fake could trend, the press could spin, but reality had weight. And in a world of fragments and filters, she'd carried the full thing, truth with roots, names, and receipts. And that made her dangerous. By morning, her team had already begun drafting a formal ethics complaint, not against Kennedy, but against the smear operation they traced to a D.C. lobbying firm with fossil fuel clients. Jasmine would not respond with another speech. She would respond with law. Because some fights don't belong in chambers. They belong in court. It didn't take long for the backlash to overshoot its target. By the 3rd day, the doctored video had been debunked in real time by multiple fact-checking outlets. Snopes flagged it as deliberately altered. Reuters confirmed the audio manipulation. Even conservative-leaning publications issued quiet retractions. But something else began to stir, something far less controllable than the spin machine. Public memory. It started small. A community newspaper in Lafayette published an editorial titled, "We Know What We Saw." The piece defended Jasmine by name and listed every factual point she had made in her remarks, citing FEMA data, flood relief history, and the exact number of unprocessed claims in Kennedy's district. Then came the open letters. University professors, environmental advocates, faith leaders across the South. One letter from a coalition of pastors in Baton Rouge read, "When the waters rise, we don't ask for party, we ask for presence. And Crockett has shown up for us more than those who claim to represent us. We saw truth that day in that chamber, and it didn't come from a man with the mic. It came from the woman who didn't need to raise her voice." Within a week, the hashtag #FloodTheRecord began trending. A call to flood congressional offices with real stories, photos, receipts, insurance denials. Anything that proved that what Jasmine had said was more than a moment. It was a mirror. District offices in Louisiana were overwhelmed. Over 1,700 constituent messages poured into Kennedy's Baton Rouge inbox. Many were from voters who had stayed silent in past cycles. Now they had questions. Why did you vote against the flood mitigation budget increase? Why haven't you visited the Bayou Lafourche rebuild sites? Why are we hearing more truth from Texas than from here? National media took notice. MSNBC's Joy Reid ran a segment titled, "The Cost of Silence: Why Crockett's Words Hit Harder Than Kennedy's Spin." CNN followed with a town hall featuring flood victims who shared their stories live, one even quoting Jasmine's line verbatim. But it wasn't just America watching. The BBC aired a story on environmental racism in southern U.S. districts, using Jasmine's speech as the opener. In the Netherlands, home to some of the world's most advanced flood defenses, an op-ed in De Volkskrant declared, "What the Dutch know," Crockett said, "if you ignore water, it will speak for you." Back in D.C., the House Environmental Subcommittee announced a new review, not of the climate bill's budget, but of district-level preparedness compliance. Louisiana's 5th was listed first. And Jasmine? She remained quiet publicly. No interviews, no press tours, just committee work. But inside her office, something had changed. Staffers worked longer, casework volumes tripled. Young activists from Mississippi to Missouri called daily, asking how to help draft similar flood equity standards for their own towns. Because Jasmine hadn't just silenced a room, she had amplified a history, and the country was no longer listening to the loudest voice. It was listening to the most grounded. It had been 3 weeks since Jasmine Crockett's quiet thunderclap in the committee room. But across Louisiana's 5th district, The aftershocks were just beginning. In Alexandria, a group of retired teachers organized a town forum titled, "Who Represents Us?" It wasn't a protest, it wasn't even angry, it was a reckoning. Residents showed up with folders, FEMA letters, flood insurance rejections, emails sent and never answered. At the front of the room was a projector screen paused on a single quote. "You cannot represent people you've never listened to underwater." The question repeated like a drumbeat. Where was Kennedy? The district that had once granted him comfortable victories was no longer silent. And it wasn't just the activists, it was the churchgoers, the small business owners, the high school coaches, people who'd once rolled their eyes at Washington, now quoting a congresswoman from Texas. A pastor in Monroe said it plainly during a Sunday sermon. "She may not be from here, but the truth she spoke was ours." In D.C., Kennedy's office scrambled. Internally, they initiated what they called Outreach Reset. Staffers were told to compile visibility metrics. Town halls attended, letters sent, even social media engagement. It became clear. The numbers didn't lie. Jasmine's 1-minute clip had been viewed more times than Kennedy's entire YouTube page in the last 5 years combined. But the problem wasn't digital. It was spiritual. Because the people weren't asking for content. They were asking for care. And Crockett, with no political territory in Louisiana, had managed to walk more streets affected by climate disaster there than their own senator. The committee hearing had kicked up more than attention. It had kicked up accountability. Congress quietly revised the legislative calendar to reopen testimony on the Equity and Environmental Response Act, a bill Kennedy had earlier mocked as symbolic. Now, under mounting public pressure, it had new traction. And for the first time, a bipartisan group from flood-prone states signed on. Jasmine's office submitted a revised provision, federal matching funds for disaster relief contingent on local office response time transparency, meaning if an elected official's office failed to return constituent emergency claims within 30 days, they would have to publicly disclose the reason or risk grant reductions. Some called it radical. Jasmine called it structural. Because no viral moment, no quote, no trend was worth anything if it didn't shift the circuitry of how power was used. Behind closed doors, even veteran lawmakers admitted it. She's changed the momentum. Outside, young women of color in law schools across the country began citing her testimony in their moot court competitions. At Howard Spelman and even LSU, students hosted panel discussions titled, "What Dignity Looks Like in Power." But not everyone was moved. Kennedy gave a primetime interview where he doubled down. "I ain't apologizing for using plain language. If folks want poetry, they should go to a bookstore." It was meant as a flex, but it landed flat. Because America wasn't just listening for poetry, it was listening for presence. And Jasmine's presence, rooted, deliberate, unflinching, had done something his metaphors never could. She had made invisible people seen. The House chamber was quiet, not out of ceremony, but anticipation. The revised Equity and Environmental Response Act was up for a final vote. What had begun as a dense piece of climate legislation, ignored by most, ridiculed by some, was now the most watched policy moment of the session. Not because of a marketing campaign, not because of any political machine, but because a single woman had let truth hang in the air long enough for a country to breathe it in. Jasmine Crockett sat in the third row, hands folded. She hadn't spoken on the bill in over a week. She didn't need to. Others were now echoing what she had said, some with her exact phrasing, others with their own voices, drawing lines from their districts to hers, from basement floods in Mississippi to chemical leaks in West Virginia. The language had changed. Suddenly, climate equity wasn't just a policy buzzword. It was a survival map. The gavel struck. The speaker read the vote tally. Passed 237 to 198. Cheers rose. But Jasmine didn't stand. She sat still for just a few more seconds, the same stillness she'd held when Kennedy laughed, the same stillness she'd used to anchor her presence when the room had dismissed her. Now it grounded her again, because this time the weight wasn't mockery, it was momentum. The bill included her provision. Federal disaster response offices would now be accountable not just for funds dispersed, but for the silence too many had lived through. The ignored calls, the unanswered letters. Now those had weight in law. Outside the chamber, press swarmed, but Jasmine stepped out a side hallway. She wasn't running from the cameras. She just had a different rhythm. In a quiet stairwell with peeling paint, she checked her phone. A text from Ms. Loretta. "Baby girl, we see you. I still got mold, but I feel heard." A text from Glenn. "Next flood, I got proof I matter." And then, one last message, unsigned but unmistakable. "You were right. I wasn't listening. I am now." She stared at that one for a while, because it meant that even the architecture that mocked her could change. Even Kennedy, wrapped in layers of legacy and performance, might have heard something real. As the Capitol emptied, Jasmine returned to her office. The walls were plain, no fanfare. Just legal briefs, water reports, and a framed photo of her parents. She removed her heels, opened her laptop, and drafted a letter, not a press release, not a tweet, but a letter, to the family she met in the Louisiana floods, thanking them, not for surviving, but for trusting her with their truth. Outside, the city buzzed. Cable news ran the headline, "Bill passes, Crockett's line becomes law." But Jasmine didn't watch it. She just sat still, until the stillness turned into something else, a quiet impact, a permanent shift, the kind that doesn't trend, but doesn't disappear either. It began with a laugh meant to diminish. It ended with legislation meant to protect. Jasmine Crockett didn't shout. She didn't storm out. She didn't even interrupt. She listened. She waited. And when she spoke, she made it count. What happened inside that chamber was not just political theater. It was a reminder that power isn't always loud, that dignity has weight, and that sometimes the most lasting change begins not with thunder, but with restraint. For every moment she held her tongue, for every constituent she carried into that room with her, for every fact she let speak louder than ego, a structure cracked, and something new took its place. A system with a little more accountability, a record with a little more truth, and a generation with one more reason to believe the chamber might yet belong to them too. Tell us what moment hit hardest. Share this story with someone who still thinks this never happens. Subscribe for stories that tell the truth, especially when it's uncomfortable. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative. Any resemblance to real events or individuals beyond public record is purely coincidental.